I can't believe I'm doing a video on a bike. Anyways, greetings from Russia, St. Petersburg, Russia to be precise, and welcome to my review of the Riese and Muller Delite GX Rolloff, which has been my daily driver, so to speak, for about 6 months or so. I am, of course, reviewing the 2017 model, but as this video will show, it doesn't really matter much because many of the components were actually replaced, so maybe if you get a 2018 model it will still be relevant. So this bike is currently at what I would say is a halfway point, meaning it's gone through about half of the upgrades that are required to take it from just a boring factory bike with a slightly interesting frame to something that's actually awesome. But even with the half of the required upgrades, I'm sure you'll find it quite a well-built machine. So let's take a look at the Delite. It's an electric bike with a Bosch CX motor. It has dual suspension, integrated rack, and even built-in fenders, which is very important. And it might feel as though this bike is the best of all worlds. Well, it can be, but you're going to have to put in the effort to actually take it to that level. So first of all, you'll notice that the bike has a dual battery. Now, there aren't many dual battery bikes out there, and believe me, the second battery does make a difference. A ballpark figure that I can give is that a single 500 watt-hour battery gives about 100 kilometers of travel on flat land in eco mode. So in theory, 2 batteries will give you 200 kilometers of travel. Of course, as soon as you actually get this bike, you're going to be traveling in tour mode instead of eco, but even on tour, you're going to get more than 100 kilometers on a single charge. Now, the 2 batteries are of course removable, and the key which locks them in place is also compatible with the integrated ABUS Bordeaux lock, which is very convenient, right? Now, the lock is actually pretty good. I've used it to leave my bike for short periods of time, though I don't really recommend leaving this particular bike out of sight for too long just because of how much it costs. Anyways, dual battery is awesome. Even if you don't go long distance travel, with dual battery you can afford the higher assist modes, which are very convenient if you live in a hilly area. Now, keep in mind that the bike has an integrated rack, and you do need the extra power as well if you decide to use the rack to carry something heavy or maybe a small child or some cargo, something like that. Now, the bike that I have here has a Bosch CX motor, which is functionally equivalent to the high-speed motor. It's literally the same motor, just different firmware, so you can save yourself about 600 euro on the high-speed motor and still get the high speeds by simply de-restricting the bike. Now, I also wanted to avoid the telltale signs of a high-speed vehicle, such as the rear number plate mount, as well as the rear view mirror. I don't really want to attract any extra attention to myself. Now, the Delite is controlled by a Bosch bike computer. In my case, I opted for the Nyan upgrade, and I have to tell you, don't get the Nyan. It's really not worth it. The Nyan is an attempt at a bike computer that does a bit more than just show the speed. I mean, it's a beautiful screen, no doubt. I mean, it's readable under all lighting conditions, but even that doesn't justify the price. A color display is extremely distracting, and the first few days that I had the bike, I had to fight the urge to stare at it all the time. Now, as far as the functionality of Nyan, you do get the screen with the speed and a few other indicators like the charge that you have left. You get a screen with some descriptive statistics such as a chart of how much you traveled on the previous few days. You do get some training screen, which looks like a fitness tracker of sorts, and then there is built-in navigation, which uses OpenStreetMap. Unfortunately, because it's using OpenStreetMap, it's very inaccurate, especially it's really bad at recalculating routes if you decide to take a different road than the one it suggests. It's also worth noting that the device only has 8 gigabytes of memory, so it can barely hold like 3 or 4 maps. So I've got Russia, Finland, Estonia, and Sweden, and that's it. There is no more memory. And when it comes to updating the maps, the process is very glitchy and prone to error, and I've had lots of trouble just to get the maps to update because it would complain about being out of memory, and it's just a really unpleasant experience. Now, the Nyan has both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capability, and it will happily upload detailed information about your rides, as well as various bike engines performance metrics to Bosch's own site. Now, this information isn't particularly useful for the end user. Now, your trips, even though you might want to just get your trip GPX, for example, your trips are typically fragmented. One of the reasons why they're fragmented is because if you leave your bike alone for a few minutes, the computer will actually shut off and it will begin a new ride. So all of these trips are actually fragmented. There is no meaningful integration with services like Strava, for example, to track your trips. So the only option that you have is a GPX export, where you export the GPX file and then you can import it somewhere. But once again, given that the Bosch computer actually switches off if you stop riding for a while, you end up with several fragmented parts of a trip, and there is no way to stick them back together. So my conclusion is that the Bosch eBike Connect is a service that's been designed for Bosch as well as companies such as the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's not for the user. It's not intended to be used by you or me, because all you're going to get is you're going to get a map of where you went, and you're going to get some statistics like what kind of engine mode you were in, and that's pretty much it. So it's just a waste of resources, I would say. There's so much interesting stuff that they could have done, but they did none of that. Now let's talk about the handlebars. Of course, I removed the installed Ergotech XXL bars because it was just a really uncomfortable and heavy handlebar. It was almost horizontal. I don't like those kinds of bars. I don't use them anywhere. So I installed the NC17 tracking, the handlebars that I have on all my bikes, well, except maybe the fat bikes, but all my bikes, including kids' bikes, have the NC17 tracking handlebar. It's a narrow tracking handlebar, and it's perfect for e-bikes. It's one of the most comfortable handlebars you can actually buy because of the rise and the sweep. You know, these are handlebars that are designed for people who want to ride with their back straight. So if you're one of those people who just want to sort of leisurely ride, shall we say, that's the handlebars for you. And of course, what's interesting is what's beneath the handlebar. That is a Fox Factory 34 fork. Now, sadly, the Delite Rolloff, if you look at the website, only has an option of either the Suntour Ion or the Fox Performance forks. So I went with the Ion before buying the Fox Factory 34 and installing it myself. Now, the Ion isn't really a terrible fork, but it's very heavy compared to the Fox, and it's not very responsive, but that's not what killed it for me. The killer issue for me was that it simply froze in sub-zero temperatures. So at minus 10 degrees centigrade, it would just stop working. And after going on hard-packed snow for about an hour or two with the Suntour Ion completely non-functional, I would start experiencing motion sickness, and I thought that's just not funny. So inside the Suntour Ion, of course, Riese and Muller also used the Novitec hubs, and this is an OEM hub, and I don't like OEM anything, to be honest, even if Novitec hubs have a good reputation. I just have this bias against OEM parts because, well, you cannot buy them yourself. That is a huge problem, actually, because if you find an OEM part that you like and it breaks, you're not going to be able to buy one yourself. You can buy a different one, but you're not going to be able to buy this exact part. Now, the Fox is, well, put simply, it's a vastly superior fork. It is lighter, it is smoother, and it is very configurable if you're into that sort of thing. Now, Riese and Muller actually does install this fork, but it only installs this on their Delite 25 bike, which, by the way, I do not recommend, because the choice of components on the Delite 25 is just idiosyncratic. It just makes absolutely no sense. And I might have another video on what I think about that bike and its configuration later on. So unlike the Suntour Ion, which has 100 millimeters of travel, this particular fork has 120 millimeter travel distance. Now, the change in bike geometry is really almost negligible, but it's worth noting that the fork steerer tube is longer, which required extra spaces underneath the stem. Now, in case you're curious, just changing the fork took about 4 hours of work, but that included rebuilding the wheel to use a boost hub, because of course the hub is slightly wider. Now, speaking of which, the front wheel spins on a Project 3-to-1 hub that's had a ceramic bearing upgrade. Now, it is, of course, a boost hub to complement this boost fork. I originally wanted to go for a DT Swiss hub, but decided to try something original, and Project 3-to-1 is delivering so far. Now, the rims are the original Alex rims MD40s, and I've even kept the spokes, maybe not the best idea, but I've kept the spokes from the old hub, even though the new hub has identical flange diameters and the old one didn't. So at some point I'm going to need to check the spoke tension on the different sides of the wheel, because this is a bit iffy. If you can get the right spokes, then do get them as you upgrade your wheel. So while we're at it, let's talk about the tires as well. So the bike came with Schwalbe Rock Razor 2.35-inch tires. Now these were semi-slick tires, and by the way, they're now also available in 2.6-inch size, but just like many other models, they weren't around in the summer of 2017. And well, what can I say? I guess plus-size tires are getting more and more popular, which is why Schwalbe is coming out with all sorts of these fatter tires. As you can see, I'm currently using the Schwalbe Ice Spiker Pro tires. These are studded tires with a width of 2.6 inches, and they are also a new model that's only been around since roughly the autumn of 2017. Now the fenders, which are integrated on this bike, are 65mm SKS fenders, and Riese Muller is actively refusing to tell me their exact make and model, which means, yep, you guessed it, it's another OEM part. Now, since I somewhat annihilated the front fender, I'm now going to sort of throw the European Union regulations book at Riese Muller, because by law manufacturers have to provide spare parts for motor vehicles for up to 10 years. Hey, it's the European Union laws. Let's see how they actually get applied. Anyway, these fenders are only a temporary solution, because at 65mm wide, they are barely wide enough to cover the tires, as you can see, the 2.6-inch tires, and I'm sad to say that I'm going to need new fenders once I go with the 3.0 tires, which, by the way, makes perfect sense considering how much space I have right now between the fork and the tire. I do have a pair of 45 North Rothschild 3-inch studded tires just waiting to go on these wheels, though to be fair, I would prefer it if Schwalbe made the ice spikers in sort of 3-inch or 3.25-inch widths, because I really like the tread pattern on the ice spikers, and so if I could get those, then that would be awesome, but unfortunately we don't have them right now. And by the way, just as an aside, I'm part of a cycling club, and nearly everyone who rides right now over the ice and snow uses the ice spiker, so it's a very popular tire. I haven't seen anybody use 45 North or Kenda or Nokian or any other kind of studded tire. I've seen some people use the V studded tires on their fat bikes, but I'm told that they're terrible, so maybe not the best idea. Now, regarding the fenders, I'm not really happy with the fenders, and not just because Riese Muller is once again using an OEM part that you cannot really buy in the store, but also because they're very fragile. And the mounting mechanism, as you can see on the left of my bike, on the front left of my bike, was torn out completely due to a light scrape with a trash bin. And of course, in Soviet Russia, they make trash bins out of concrete, so that could have something to do with it. Also, once you change the fork, you also need a different top attachment part for the fork. So at the moment, I'm using rather ugly zip ties to hold the mudguard together. Like I said, this bike is at a halfway point right now, and things are definitely going to improve. So my front suspension, I think, is generally sorted. I ride with the fork typically in the open state, and I must admit that I don't really touch the compression and rebound settings at all. But the level of comfort on this fork, it's just another level. So I strongly recommend getting a good fork. But instead of the upgrade that Riese Muller gives you, I suggest that you get the cheap Suntour. And when I say cheap, it's not really cheap. It's like 400 euros if you buy it separately. And then you buy the Fox Factory. And then do what you want with the Suntour. You can sell it, or you just I'm just going to give away my Suntour fork because, well, it's I don't want to even try selling it. Now, here is another nice touch, because attached to the fork we have the Supernova M99 Pro, which is pretty much the best light you can get, period. So as far as I understand, it's a 12-volt light, which means you can't attach it, or you couldn't attach it to a Yamaha bike, because the Yamaha PW motors didn't actually support sort of 12 volts of power. Now this light, of course, draws much more power, so it makes perfect sense for a dual battery bike. Now the Supernova M99 Pro is designed for speed pedelecs, or those bikes with the 45 kph limit that require, insurance and whatnot. This light is always on, and it cannot be switched off on the display. I mean it's always shining, but there is a light sensor in there. Its intensity adjusts to the amount of ambient light, so it's not such a big deal actually. There are two modes. There is the normal beam, which is bright enough by itself, and there's the high beam, or what we call distance light. Now, the modes are controlled by a remote on the handlebar, so yes, there's an extra remote here with just a single button. Now, the normal beam itself is extremely powerful, and it really scares away pedestrians in the dark of winter. And the high beam, well, take a look at my bike. You can see that the light is kind of pointed down, and this is deliberate because I don't want to be blinding anyone, car drivers included. Now, let's talk about the rear suspension. Now, my bike still has the original X-Fusion 02 element. Since I didn't go for the Fox upgrade up front, I still have this shock. Now, first of all, I have to say it's a good shock. It's reasonable. I don't like the fact that it's another OEM part that you cannot buy because, well, if it breaks, you can't replace it with an identical item, but it's good. It's good for what it is. In terms of controls, you can only change the rebound. There is no lockout, and this is a problem for me because I use the rear rack to have a child sitting there, and my child is heavy, and when you overload the rack, what happens is the rear fender starts pressing against the tire, which is not nice, and having a lockout would certainly be very useful. Now, I am going to replace the shock in the near future. It's going to be either a Fox Float Factory or more likely a RockShox Monarch, which I've got on some of my other bikes and I really enjoy. I don't really care much for the whole business of electronically controlled shocks, and I find even the mechanical remotes for the shock lockout to be a bit gimmicky. Now let's talk about the rear Rolloff hub. Now Rolloff is of course a luxury, but on a bike like this it's a perfect fit. Of course, we now have the electronic Rolloff gear shift, what they call the E7, so that's what you should probably get if you're buying a bike right now, but I still have the manual Rolloff shift, and for the most part it's just a zero maintenance hub that also happens to be able to handle high speeds. Now there are 14 gears to choose from, and Rolloff requires that you run 2 cables to the hub, and you'll notice that one of these 2 cables that I have has already become damaged, and this is not because I deliberately damaged it, it's because the angle at which the cable leaves the actual shifter and goes into the bike is a really unnatural angle, and so that's why there's been some strain there. I might have to install something to prevent complete deterioration of the cable at some point. Now, Rolloff isn't perfect. There are issues with it. So first and most importantly, you cannot shift while pedaling or even just casually pressing on the pedal. So if you stop in front of a traffic light and you're maybe holding your hand at a lamppost and you have your feet on the pedals, not pedaling, not going anywhere, you still cannot shift, which is infuriating. But it's really more of a problem if you do something like the following. So suppose you're cycling and suddenly you're knee-deep in snow, and you need to very quickly stop pedaling before lowering the gear. And I'm sorry to say that sometimes it's just not realistic, and sometimes I have to stop the bike altogether before actually shifting to the required gear. Also, shifting under pressure can seriously misfire. If you are pedaling and you try to shift, you can end up with either the Rolloff hub failing to switch gears, so it gets stuck in the old gear even though you've gone to the new one, or there is something that's much worse that can happen. You can go to a neutral gear. And yes, I'm talking about a neutral gear like a neutral on a car, where in neutral the drivetrain is disconnected from the pedals in this case. And this is extremely disconcerting because you're pedaling and absolutely nothing is happening because it's all disconnected. But you really have to struggle to get this kind of operation, but it is possible. It has happened to me on multiple occasions. Now, the second problem with Rolloff is with the shifter. And first of all, it's very heavy shifting. Now, you couldn't install a Rolloff shifter on a kid's bike because a child just wouldn't be able to turn this. There's just, there is too much force required for the turning of the shifter. Now, the second problem with the shifter is the clicks between the gears aren't strong enough. And this means that when you're wearing thick gloves, you don't really feel that you've changed the gear, and as a result you can sort of accidentally change the gear halfway, which can cause problems in the hub, which again reduce it to either the speed not changing or the hub going to neutral, which is infuriating. Now, the grip shifter makes it really hard to quickly change the gear range. So sometimes you want to go, let's say, from 10th gear to 3rd gear. Your hands are simply not adapted to turn the shifter that much. So you're not going to be able to do this quickly, even though with a in the case of a roll-off, it would make sense to create some sort of mechanism to do exactly that, because unlike a cassette where you have to sort of move the chain from one side to another, here it could be almost instant, but unfortunately we'll just have to wait and see how the electronic shifting goes on the roll-off, because I haven't tried that yet. All right. Now, as far as the chain goes, obviously a single speed chain, and chains do get destroyed rather quickly, and there is this myth that a single speed chain lasts something like 6 to 8 times longer than if you had a derailleur or something, but this is a myth. My first chain failed at about 2,000 kilometers, which for an e-bike is nothing. For an e-bike, it's like 20 trips worth of 100 kilometers of travel. Now, I'm well aware of the belt systems, including the Gates carbon drive, but first of all, that upgrade wasn't available when I was getting the bike, and it's not available now. And even if it was available, I wouldn't go for it, because you see, a chain costs something like 10 to 20 euros, and you can find one in any bike shop. Now, a belt, if it fails, means you're doomed. And I don't want to be doomed somewhere in the middle of a snowstorm somewhere in Finland, so I'd rather have the extra chain. Now, the same goes for tubeless wheels, for example. It's a nice idea, but it's pointless on an e-bike and not as safe, so I just use tubes for my wheels. It's also worth noting that the carbon drive requires very precise measurements and the replacement of both the front and the rear sprockets. It's not really a problem because they sell all the corresponding bike parts, but I just don't want the extra hassle. Maybe I'll try it at some point, but I don't know when. Now, let's talk about the rear wheel. This is where I started getting problems with the fender, of course. First of all, because the rear shock has no lockout, if you get a child or some weight that weighs over 25 kilos, it's going to compress the rear rack to a point where the fender pushes into the wheel. So that's particularly unpleasant. But there is a much more unpleasant issue related to the rear fender that implies that, well, for fatter tires, you just need a completely different fender. Let me explain what the problem is. If you look at the sort of marketing picture of the Delite on the Riese Muller website, you'll see that there is generally uniform space between the tire, the rear tire, and the fender in all locations except one that's right here. Now, in this particular location, there is a lot less space, and what this means is that, what this meant for me is when I installed the rear spike tire, it started scratching the rear fender, and this issue, in my opinion, is quite simply a design flaw. Somebody just didn't do their geometry completely, and unfortunately, it's at a location where you can really do nothing with the fender. You cannot move it back and forward because it's right up against the edge of the rear bracket. So maybe this flaw can be fixed, maybe not. No, my solution was just to file away some parts of the fender using some sandpaper, but clearly what you want is you want to be able to stick fatter tires if you want to, because the rear dropout sizes on the Delite are huge. I would say they're big enough for maybe 3.8-inch tires. I don't know, maybe more. Of course, they are constrained by this annoying design issue, and even if I were to remove the fender, there would be no way of actually moving the wheel from the edge of the rear bracket. In actual fact, there might be a way, and I might do a video on that at some point. But let's get back to the rear world. So one thing I didn't mention is the seat. Obviously, I kept the original seat post, but I don't like the fact it's a non-standard size, but I kept it. It's a very thick seat post, which is okay, I guess, but I threw away the seat immediately. Instead, what I'm using is the Surface RX Cruiser, which is a seat that I have on all my adult bikes. Not the kids' bikes, obviously, but all the adult bikes, I have this particular seat. It's an awesome seat. Another thing that I threw away immediately is the cheap plasticky pedals that came with this bike. I don't know why manufacturers can't put something nice on there, but I guess it's so that you can pick your own pedals. So I threw away the cheap plastic stuff and installed the Shimano Saint MX-80 pedals. Now, strictly speaking, these are downhill-oriented pedals, but they're just studded platform pedals, and they look rather nice. So I've seen many people use them on all sorts of bikes, including mechanical bikes, fat bikes, that sort of thing. And of course, I use them on all the bikes I own, and they've been great so far, despite I've heard people complain about them. Alright, so I think that's enough for this video. I'll show you how the bike rides, but there is actually a blizzard going on outside, so I don't think I'll bother, maybe some next time. So thanks for watching, and I hope Riese and Muller are paying attention to this video too. So take care and stay tuned for more bike videos, maybe.